Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human researched and written material.
Right.
So if you break an arm, an X-ray gives you this really clean, jagged, undeniable white line. I mean, the diagnosis is totally binary.
Broken or not broken.
Exactly. Broken or not broken. But what happens when the broken thing isn't your arm, but, your moral compass?
That is a much harder X-ray to read.
It really is. Today, we're staring into the muddy waters of human behavior, trying to figure out how to make the right choice in just a profoundly messy world.
And while that murkiness isn't some new modern invention, we are jumping into a text that was forged in maybe the messiest political environment of antiquity.
Oh, without a doubt.
We're looking at Book 1 of Cicero's De Officiis, which basically translates to on moral duties. Mm-hmm. And I want to stress, this is an abstract theory.
Right, it's not just a textbook.
No, it's a survival guide for the soul. I mean, it was written by a man whose entire civilization was literally collapsing around him while he held the pen.
Which makes our mission for this deep dive pretty clear. We want to extract Cicero's timeless framework to help you, the listener, balance ambition, morality, and social obligation today.
Because we certainly still struggle with those things.
Oh, we really do. But before we get into the actual rules he lays out, we have to look at his foundational premise.
Right, the core of his message.
Yeah, because it completely subverts that whole stereotype of the ancient philosopher just, sitting around in a toga, pondering the infinite.
Pondering the cosmos, right?
Exactly. For Cicero, the ultimate goal of philosophy isn't finding absolute unshakable truth with a capital T.
No, the goal is action.
The goal is action. And that distinction changes how we read the entire book, doesn't it?
It completely flips it. I mean, to understand why he prioritizes action over absolute truth, we kind of have to look at his underlying philosophical operating system.
Okay, let's break that down.
So, Cicero considered himself a skeptic. Specifically, he aligned with this group called the New Academy.
Wait, I feel like when modern people hear the word skeptic, we just picture a cynic.
Yeah, someone who just complains.
Right, like someone who shoots down everyone else's ideas and just believes in nothing. But that's not what the New Academy was doing, was it?
Not at all. I mean, the philosophers of the New Academy, going back to guys like Carneades, they were looking at a very specific problem with how we know things.
An epistemological problem.
Exactly. They looked at competing schools like the hardline Stoics, who really believed humans could achieve this absolute, undeniable comprehension of the universe.
They call it catalepsis, right?
Right, catalepsis. But the new academicians argued against that. They said, look, human perception is fundamentally flawed.
Our senses deceive us.
Yes, our senses deceive us, our biases blind us. So claiming you possess absolute truth isn't just arrogant, it's intellectually dishonest.
Which feels incredibly relevant today. I mean, the idea that we can't be 100% certain of our own absolute rightness is a pretty healthy antidote to modern polarization.
It forces some humility.
It does. But it also raises a massive problem. If you believe absolute truth is unknowable, how do you even get out of bed in the morning?
Right. What's the point?
Yeah. How do you decide what a good action is if you don't know what is universally true?
And that right there is the trap of nihilism. But Cicero brilliantly sidesteps it. He embraces this concept known as the probable, or the truth-like.
The probable. Okay.
He argues that, sure, we can't possess divine certainty, but we do possess reason.
We have brains.
Exactly. We can gather evidence, we can weigh historical precedents, debate the outcomes, and arrive at what is most likely true or most likely right in any given situation.
So philosophy can't just be this endless, paralyzing debate.
No, it has to be a tool to navigate the probable world. He basically argues that virtue is completely hollow, that it doesn't even really exist until it is realized in practice.
So virtue is a verb.
Virtue is a verb.
Okay, so if we can't know the absolute truth, but we still have to act, we need a reliable system to govern those actions.
And that anxiety over how to act is exactly why Cicero constructs his framework of the 4 cardinal virtues.
Now, historically, people describe these virtues as the 4 pillars of a building. But I don't love that. Pillars just stand there.
They're very static.
Right, and Cicero is obsessed with action and forward momentum. So as we break these down, I want you to think of these 4 virtues like the critical systems of a car.
Navigating a treacherous mountain road.
Yes, exactly. Because these virtues are dynamic mechanisms, not just decorations.
That makes a lot of sense.
So let's start with the first system, which is wisdom. This is the navigation system.
It's the search for truth and the processing of information.
Right. But keeping with his bias toward action, Cicero places a massive governor on this engine. He essentially says, do not get lost in obscure, useless studies at the expense of an active life.
He is drawing a really hard line against the academic recluse here.
He really is.
He says that being drawn away by pure study from active life is contrary to moral duty. You can study the stars, you can master math, but the whole glory of virtue is in activity.
So if your navigation system is incredibly advanced, but you never put the car in drive,
you're failing.
You are absolutely failing. Which brings us to the second system. This handles the most complex variables on the road, and that's justice.
Right.
If wisdom is the navigation, justice is the steering wheel. It dictates how we maneuver around and with other people.
And Cicero defines this through two primary mechanisms. First, doing no harm to anyone.
Okay.
And second, using common goods for the common interest while maintaining private property for your own.
So it's literally the mechanism that prevents us from crashing into each other.
Exactly. And the power steering fluid making that wheel turn smoothly is what he calls good faith.
Good faith, like keeping promises.
Right. Fidelity to agreements. Because society just ceases to function the moment we can no longer trust the deals we make with one another.
We'll definitely get into the nuances of that later. But it leads right into the third system, which is fortitude, or greatness of spirit.
So if we're sticking with the car analogy, fortitude is the suspension system.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, it's the ability to absorb shocks without the chassis snapping.
Because we usually just translate fortitude as courage.
We do, but Cicero's definition is much deeper than just bravery on a battlefield. It's a psychological resilience.
Superiority to earthly vicissitudes.
Exactly. It is the internal shock absorber that prevents you from being crushed by sudden tragedy. Or, and this is equally dangerous, seduced by sudden wealth and power.
Which leaves us with the final system, temperance. This is the braking system.
Orderliness, moderation.
Yes, self-control in your daily behavior. It's reading the room of life and applying the right measure of restraint so you don't just, spin out of control.
So we have the navigation of wisdom, the steering of justice, the suspension of fortitude, and the brakes of temperance.
But driving in the real world means these systems conflict a lot.
Oh, constantly. What happens when the road forks and steering toward justice requires you to ignore the navigation of wisdom?
This is where the rubber meets the road. Cicero introduces this decision-making matrix called the 5-part calculation of duty.
And to understand how radical this is, we kind of have to look at where he got it.
From the Greek Stoic, Panatius.
Right. Panatius had a 3-step process for tough choices. Cicero looks at it and is like, this is entirely insufficient for human life. We need 5 steps.
So how does the calculation actually work? Because it feels like the most practical tool in the entire text.
It really is. So Panatius originally said we asked 3 questions. First, is the act right or wrong?
Morally speaking.
Yes. Second, is it expedient or inexpedient?
Meaning, does it materially benefit me? My money, my physical safety?
Exactly. And most people stop right there.
We really do. We just ask, is this good for me? And is it legal?
But the third step, the final step for Panatius, is the crucible. Step 3 asks, what happens when what is morally right directly conflicts with what is expedient?
Ah, the classic dilemma. Expediency pulls you one way like a lucrative contract, while moral duty calls you back the other way.
That tension is the core of human drama, and Panatius felt that just identifying this conflict was enough.
But Cicero says, no, we need 2 more calculations, because life isn't a clean binary.
Right. So let's put this into a modern pressure cooker to see how it works.
Okay, imagine a corporate whistleblower.
Perfect.
You are an executive, and you discover your company is illegally dumping toxic waste into a local water supply.
Step 1. Is it morally right to expose them? Yes.
Step 2. Is it expedient to keep quiet? Yes, it saves your career, your pension.
Step 3 is that agonizing realization that the moral choice destroys your expediency and the expedient choice destroys your morality.
Okay, so here comes Cicero's additions. Step 4. If 2 things are both morally right, which one is more right?
And step 5. If 2 things are both expedient, which one is more expedient?
It's basically a triage system.
It is. So let's apply step 4 to our whistleblower. Say the executive signed a strict non-disclosure agreement.
Right, an NDA.
It is morally right to keep promises. That's a fundamental part of justice.
But it is also morally right to protect a community from being poisoned.
Exactly. So Cicero demands we calculate which right carries more weight. And here, the duty to the broader human fellowship outweighs the duty to a corporate contract.
And then step 5 calculates competing expediencies.
Right. Is it more expedient to stay quiet and keep your salary, or is it more expedient to blow the whistle, lose your job, but, avoid going to federal prison when the EPA eventually finds out?
He forces you to weigh the long-term reality over the short-term benefit.
And this sheer pragmatism makes so much more sense when you realize the absolute chaos Cicero was living through while he wrote it.
The context is just staggering.
You can't fully grasp De Officiis without understanding Rome in 44 BC.
It's terrifying. The Roman Republic had stood for nearly 500 years. Cicero dedicated his entire life to defending it, and now it was essentially dead.
Julius Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, started a civil war, declared himself dictator for life.
And then, on the Ides of March, he gets assassinated on the Senate floor.
And a lot of people thought, great, the tyrant is dead, the Republic is back.
But that never works.
No, removing a tyrant doesn't magically resurrect democratic institutions. Instead, this massive, violent power vacuum opens up.
Right. Mark Antony is raging through the city trying to seize military control.
The Senate is paralyzed. The law courts are closed.
And Cicero's entire occupation, his reason for being, is stripped away overnight. And worse, his life is in imminent danger.
He's quite literally on Mark Antony's hit list.
Fleeing from one country villa to another. He can't show his face in Rome. He's just watching warlords carve up the state.
So he's working at the highest possible psychological tension just to avoid being consumed by sorrow.
He couldn't physically act in the Senate, so his action became writing.
He turned to philosophy as a lifeline to maintain his sanity.
And who does he throw this lifeline to? This is the best part.
The audience of one.
Right. He writes this monumental text as a letter to his son, Marcus, who was 21 and supposedly studying philosophy in Athens.
But the human element here, the contrast between the father's situation and the son's behavior, it's almost comical.
Comical is a good word for it. Cicero is running for his life, writing this 2,000-year masterpiece on temperance and duty. Meanwhile, Marcus is basically on a modern-day spring break.
He's supposedly studying under Cratopus, the great philosopher.
Sure he is. In reality, he's partying, drinking heavily, and just sowing an unbelievable crop of wild oats.
And Cicero is funding the whole thing.
Yes. Historians calculate the allowance Cicero gave him was roughly equivalent to, 870 pounds a year in late 19th century money.
Adjusted for today, it's a staggering fortune for a college kid.
He is actively funding the boy's riotous living while writing him an urgent plea to embrace virtue.
It's wonderfully ironic, but it also highlights a massive cultural clash between Greek metaphysics and Roman practicality.
Let's get into that, because the Romans had a very complicated relationship with Greek thought.
They really did. Marcus is in Athens, the center of Greek philosophy. They loved deep, abstract speculation about the cosmos and the soul.
But the Romans viewed pure speculation with deep suspicion.
Because of the momirum, the way the ancestors.
The unwritten social code, prioritizing duty, military discipline, and loyalty to the state above everything else.
Precisely. Their society relied on unthinking adherence to civic duty. If a general orders a legion to hold a line, he needs them to hold it out of duty.
He doesn't need a soldier pausing to ask, wait, what is the ultimate moral nature of this violence?
Exactly. Does this align with universal justice? No. The Romans feared that Greek philosophy was basically an intellectual virus that would dismantle their military discipline.
And it wasn't just a mild distaste. In 161 BC, the Roman Senate passed a decree formally banning all philosophers from the city of Rome.
They literally kicked them out. They said, we have an empire to run. We don't have time to debate the nature of the universe.
The Romans were relentlessly practical.
And what Cicero does so brilliantly in De Officiis is act as a translator. He takes these lofty Greek ideas,
strips away the cosmic debates.
Right, and repackages them into a hyper-practical, get-things-done Roman framework.
He's basically telling Marcus, here is the Roman operating system. Here is how you actually use these concepts to be a man of impact.
So let's take that Roman operating system and boot it up in the 21st century.
Let's do it. Because when you apply his hyper-practical lens to our modern behavior, it immediately flags things we consider totally normal.
Take the pillar of justice, for instance.
Yeah, if I ask a modern listener, are you a just person? Most of us would say yes.
Because we equate justice with the absence of malice.
Right. I don't steal, I don't commit fraud, I don't hit people, therefore I'm just.
But Cicero shatters that. He argues there are two distinct kinds of injustice.
Okay, what's the first?
The first is what we all recognize. inflicting wrong upon another person.
Simple enough.
But the second kind of injustice is failing to prevent wrong when you have the power to do so.
Wow. That is a direct attack on modern apathy.
And our obsession with minding our own business.
Yeah. He argues that injustice actively occurs when you fail to defend someone because you're preoccupied.
Maybe you don't want to incur trouble or expense, or maybe you're just hyper-focused on your own career trajectory.
The ultimate modern defense. It's not my problem. I'm just focusing on my grind.
Hustle culture.
Totally. But Cicero says steering clear of others to focus solely on your own success is a betrayal.
You become a traitor to social life because you contribute none of your effort or means to the human fellowship.
He even targets philosophers with this, doesn't he?
He does. He notes that some intellectuals think they're perfectly just because they're busy pursuing truth and despising worldly things.
They think their intellectual purity absolves them of civic duty.
And Cicero says no. You fall into the opposite injustice. True justice isn't merely having clean hands. It requires engagement. It requires friction.
The implications for us are staggering. It means you can't just keep your head down, build your startup, and declare yourself a good person just because you didn't step on anyone's neck.
If your success isolates you in a bubble where you never protect the vulnerable, you're committing a daily injustice of omission.
That focus on the practical reality of justice brings us to another intensely modern application. Chicanery.
Ah, yes. Weaponizing the letter of the law to violate the spirit of the law.
Cicero provides some incredible historical examples here. Walk us through the 30-day truce.
So there was a famous general who made a formal truce with an enemy state for 30 days. The fighting was supposed to stop.
Sounds peaceful.
But the general immediately mobilized his troops and went out to ravage the enemy's fields under the cover of darkness.
Wait, why?
Because when confronted, his defense was purely semantic. He argued that the truce explicitly stipulated days and said nothing about nights.
That is just staggering audacity.
It is, but it highlights something vital about ancient law. Their legal system was heavily influenced by religious ritual.
Where the exact incantation of words mattered more than intent.
Right. If you said the wrong word during a sacrifice, the gods rejected it. And this general is applying that obsessive literalism to a peace treaty.
And Cicero completely rejects it.
He quotes a proverb, more law, less justice. The more oversubtle and technically complex the rules become, the further society drifts from actual fairness.
It sounds exactly like a modern corporation using an obscure loophole in a 50-page terms of service agreement to sell your data.
Technically under Clause 4B.
Right. You consented to having your digital life monetized. It's legally binding, but morally bankrupt.
Cicero gives another fascinating example with Quintus Fabius Labeo.
The arbitrator who turns into a real estate swindler.
Exactly. The Roman Senate appointed Labeo to arbitrate a border dispute between Nola and Naples.
Okay.
He travels down there, but instead of meeting them together, he goes to each side separately. He pressures them, saying, don't be greedy, make a concession, and step back from your maximum claim.
So, trusting the Roman, both sides agree and pull back.
Leaving a considerable strip of newly freed territory right in the middle.
And Labeo looks at this buffer zone and says, great, I'll just take this middle land and award it to the Roman Republic.
Cicero is utterly disgusted. He says, now that is swindling, not arbitration.
Exploiting trust is fundamentally unjust, which transitions perfectly into how Cicero views leadership. Today, we idolize this combative warrior mentality in business.
The CEO going to war with the competition.
Constant military metaphors in the boardroom, and that obsession existed in Rome too, right?
Very much so. They were an empire built on conquest. But Cicero argues forcefully for the superiority of civic courage over military glory.
I struggled with his conclusion here, honestly. He compares Solon and Themistocles.
Right.
Themistocles was the general who won the Battle of Salamis, literally saving Greece from annihilation. That is a civilization-saving victory. Yet Cicero ranks Solon, a politician who lived decades earlier, as the greater hero. Am I missing something, or is Cicero just biased because he's a statesman?
It's easy to accuse him of bias, but his logic is rooted in how civilizations actually survive.
Okay.
Themistocles served the state once in a crisis. But Cicero asks, why did Athens have a state capable of fighting off the Persians in the first place?
Ah, the institutions.
Solon instituted the foundational laws. He created the structural discipline that allowed a society to produce a general like Themistocles.
So Solon's work serves the state forever, while the general's work serves it for a day.
Without the unglamorous institution building, there's no functional state to defend.
He's arguing that quiet diplomacy and preventing war require vastly more intellectual fortitude than picking up a sword.
Exactly.
I think for the listener, this is a moment to audit your own career. Are you constantly looking for fires to put out so you can rush in and be the hero? Or are you doing the tedious work of building systems that prevent the fires entirely?
We reward the firefighters, but Cicero tells us to revere the architects.
That architectural mindset leads right into the practical application of this wisdom. He gives us specific practices. Let's start with the first one, dealing with promises.
The sixth son clause.
This is so counterintuitive. We are drilled to believe that keeping your word, no matter what, is the ultimate test of integrity.
But Cicero says rigid adherence to a promise can actually become a vice.
He anchors this in the myth of Neptune and Theseus.
Yes. Neptune promised to grant his mortal son Theseus 3 wishes. Later, Theseus is tricked into believing his own son, Hippolytus, committed a horrific crime.
And in a fit of rage, Theseus uses a wish to pray for his son's death.
And Neptune, bound by his word, keeps the promise. The son is killed, plunging Theseus into grief when the truth comes out.
So the lesson is that if Neptune had actual moral duty, he would have broken the promise to save Theseus from his own anger.
Exactly. The mechanism is the calculation of harm. Promises shouldn't be kept if keeping them causes disproportionate harm.
And he applies this to everyday life, right? Like the sixth son example.
Right. Suppose you promise to appear in court for a friend, but on the morning of the trial, your son falls dangerously ill.
If you leave your sick kid to go to court, just to prove you are a man of your word, you aren't being virtuous.
You are being dangerously rigid. The greater duty to protect vulnerable life supersedes the lesser duty of a schedule.
So the actionable advice here is to audit your commitments. Are you forcing a deal through even though circumstances have changed? And keeping the promise will cause massive collateral damage.
Breaking that promise actually becomes your moral duty.
Our second practice is what we can call the audit of generosity. Cicero says generosity requires extreme caution.
Because true generosity cannot be funded by injustice. He specifically calls out guys like Lucius Sulla and Julius Caesar.
They threw lavish public spectacles, gave cash gifts. They looked like philanthropists.
But the funding mechanism was corrupt. They were robbing conquered peoples and political enemies to pay their friends.
Cicero says if you steal from Peter to pay Paul, you aren't a benefactor. You're just a thief redistributing spoils.
He also attacks the psychological motive. Many people give just to make a public show of being open-handed.
The ancient equivalent of filming yourself handing money to a homeless person for social media clout.
It's hypocrisy driven by vanity. And another trap. Giving only to people you want favors from.
The corruption of networking. Buying a wealthy CEO an expensive dinner, but ignoring the junior employee who needs 5 minutes of your mentorship.
We have to ask, are you giving to seem generous? Or are you giving based on actual need?
Which brings up our third practice, the fruitful field. If someone gives something to me, how am I supposed to react?
Cicero borrows agricultural wisdom from the poet Hesiod. He asks, shall we not imitate the fruitful fields which return more than they receive?
A field takes a few dead-looking seeds and gives back a massive harvest.
The return is exponentially greater.
So when was the last time you treated a favor like a field treats a seed? Did you just send a quick thanks text? Or did you actively seek to return that energy with interest?
Failing to requite a kindness is simply not allowable for a good person. It's the mechanism of social cohesion.
But as we dive deeper, we hit some serious friction. There are ideas here that are deeply countercultural. Let's tackle the hierarchy of allegiance.
Cicero strictly ranks our duties. Number 1, country. Number 2, parents. Number 3, children and family. Number 4, relatives.
Okay, I have to stop right there. Country over children.
I know it sounds harsh.
If you tell a modern Western listener to prioritize the state over their own kids, they will reject that immediately.
It feels unnatural to us because we view the state as just a utility company. But his logic is structural. He writes, one native land embraces all our loves.
That is stunning.
The state is the foundational vessel that allows your family to exist safely. Without the country, your children have no protection from invading armies.
The state is the ship that holds your family's cabin.
Exactly. If the ship is sinking, barricading yourself in your cabin to protect your children is fatally short-sighted. You owe your highest duty to the structure that sustains the whole.
The logic is sound, but emotionally, asking someone to sacrifice their child for a political entity is a massive hurdle.
And then he throws another obstacle at us, indifference to outward fortune.
Right. He argues you must be indifferent to wealth, glory, and power.
That nothing but moral goodness deserves to be striven after.
Okay, wait, I have to challenge this. Cicero is a multi-millionaire writing from one of his luxury country villas. He is funding his son's 870-day-a-year party lifestyle.
The hypocrisy is glaring.
Isn't it incredibly easy for a rich politician to sit on his veranda and say, money doesn't matter?
It is the exact criticism his contemporaries gave him. His defense would be that acquiring wealth to hoard it is the vice. Using it to serve the state is acceptable.
That feels like a very convenient loophole.
It is. But we still have to evaluate his warning. He warns that the lust for power and wealth inevitably dismantles justice.
He's pointing directly at Julius Caesar.
Yes. When you care too much about outward fortune, you eventually rationalize compromising your morality to secure it.
This brings us to a crucial phase. Practicing wisdom with discernment. Because as much as Cicero talks about humility, the man had an ego the size of the Colosseum.
It was legendary.
He literally quotes his own poetry, "Arms yield to the toga."
Meaning politicians are more important than generals.
Right, and then he casually drops that Pompey the Great admitted to him that all his military triumphs would be useless if Cicero hadn't saved Rome with his statesmanship.
He writes, "I may boast to you, my son Marcus, for to you belong the inheritance of that glory of mine."
It's comical. But we can separate the utility of his framework from his vanity.
We have to, and we also have to confront the much darker realities of his ancient worldview, the massive blind spots regarding slavery and conquest.
His definition of justice completely accepts the Roman Empire expanding by force.
He claims private property comes from long occupancy, or conquest.
And his view on enslaved people is deeply dissonant. He advises treating them as we should our employees. They must be required to work. They must be given their dues.
Which, in 44 BC, is remarkably progressive. He's actively advocating against cruelty.
But he still fundamentally condones owning human beings.
Right. His imagination stops short of total abolition. We have to read this with clear eyes, acknowledging his moral failings while extracting the cognitive tools that remain useful.
Yet despite those severe blind spots, he taps into a broader human truth. Let's look at the idea of maintaining honor among enemies.
The story of Regulus. This defies every modern survival instinct.
Walk us through it.
During the First Punic War, the Roman general Regulus is captured by the Carthaginians. They send him back to Rome on parole to negotiate a prisoner exchange.
But they bind him with an oath.
Right. If the Senate refuses the exchange, Regulus has to voluntarily return to Carthage to remain a prisoner.
Okay, so he gets back to Rome. He is home, safe with his family. What does he do?
He advises the Senate against the deal.
Wait, he lobbies for his own captivity?
Yes. He argues it's not in Rome's interest to exchange healthy young commanders for an old, broken general like himself.
So the Senate rejects the treaty.
And despite the pleas of his family, he willfully honors his oath. He returns to Carthage, fully knowing he's walking into death by torture.
Because fidelity to a promise demanded it.
He chose destruction over proving false to his oath, even an oath to a deadly enemy.
That is an astonishing level of psychological fortitude. And Cicero brings up another example with Hannibal.
Right. Hannibal sends 10 Roman captives to Rome to negotiate ransom, bound by an oath to return if they fail.
The Senate refuses the ransom.
Most captives return. But one tries a loophole. He leaves the camp, walks a short distance, then goes back claiming she forgot something.
The ultimate chicanery.
Then he heads to Rome, arguing his second departure fulfilled his oath to return.
Did the Romans welcome his cleverness?
Not at all. The Roman censors degraded and disenfranchised him. Cicero says we must consider the meaning of a promise, not mere words.
And then there's the story of King Pyrrhus.
A deserter offered to assassinate Pyrrhus with poison. The Roman Senate arrested the deserter and handed him back to Pyrrhus.
Because they refused to win by treachery.
Exactly. How you fight is just as important as what you're fighting for. If you use treachery to defeat a monster, you just become the new monster.
That connects beautifully to Cicero's vision of the universal bond of humanity.
He quotes the poet Ennius, "Deny no one the water that flows by, and let anyone who you'll take fire from our fire."
Meaning we are all connected by our shared capacity for rational thought.
Long before modern concepts of globalism or human rights, Cicero argued for a common bond transcending your tribe or nation.
So as we bring this deep dive to a close, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought based on Cicero's assertion that true greatness relies on deeds, not fame.
Right.
Imagine a scenario where you were completely stripped of all public recognition. If your social media accounts were deleted, if no one at work ever praised you again, If all reputational reward just vanished, which of your good deeds would you still perform?
Are you acting for the gallery or for the good?
Exactly. That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.